Hello and welcome to the Research Connection podcast, the show that brings current expertise and cutting-edge research and connects it with users in the community.
So let's get started. Could each of you introduce yourselves so we know who's talking?
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Eftihia Mihelakis. I'm a professor at Brandon University in the Department of Classical and Modern Languages and Gender Women Studies. I teach French language courses and French and Francophone culture and literature courses. And many of my courses are also interdisciplinary and crossover with historical, cultural, and social issues related to gender.
And Eva.
My name's Eva Eberts, and I am the French curriculum specialist for the Brandon School Division. And basically my job is to support teachers and students in improving their French language learning, their appreciation of French culture, and basically validation of their French language experience.
Hi everyone, I am Jackie Kirk, and I am one of the co-hosts of the podcast. I am the chair of Leadership and Educational Administration in the Faculty of Education at Brandon University. The one thing I was thinking about, Michelle, is that it might be good just to say to the listeners that, you know, we are observing our stay-at-home request and that there might be background noise today that, you know, normally wouldn't be part of our podcast, but it could happen from anyone's home. Specifically mine might be dog barking, but we'll try to guard against that.
Yeah, we'll do our best. It is what it is. Yeah, we're all working from home. My name's Michelle Lamb. I'm the director of BU CARES. CARES is the Center for Aboriginal and Rural Education Studies. So to get started, I thought it would be good to just talk a little bit about terminology. And I know there are different words for French, Francophone, French language programs, French immersion programs. So I thought, could we just start there? And can you just give us sort of the basics, a primer on what language we should be using?
Sure. Eva, if you want to jump in at any time, feel free. So I thought it would be important to just talk a little bit about some of the vocabulary words that we use in reference to all of those adjectives to which you were referring, Michelle. One important thing that I've learned as a native Quebecois coming to Manitoba more than 3.5 years now, is that there's a really clear distinction to be made between French and Francophone or Franco-Canadian. And I think that's important because when we say French, we could refer to the French language, but French refers to the nation of France. And in that respect, using terms like Franco-Canadian, which was recently approved by many associations, literary and cultural associations across Canada, and also teaching associations across Canada, as being specific to the historical evolution of Franco-Canadian communities, both intra-provincially and inter-provincially, make it significant for us to identify that. When we speak about French, therefore, I think we're really speaking about the language, or we're speaking about the country or the nation of France, but in the context of Canada, because French is one of the 2 official languages, and there are specific identity and cultural specificities in each province, then Franco-Canadian or Franco-Manitoban or Franco-Albertan or Quebecois. These are the types of adjectives which are more representative of the reality of each province.
And in Brandon, maybe Eva, you could talk to this. In Brandon, what is the current state of French language programs?
Sure. Like in terms of our French immersion programs, the numbers have been steadily rising, although more recently, from the latest numbers I've heard, that they're starting to plateau a little bit. But in general, the immersion program still tends to be a very, very popular program. And in terms of the English program for French, again, we still have good numbers in the grades 4 to 6. More recently, with some of the changes in middle year options, we have seen some drops in numbers in grades 7 and 8. But again, for the students that are taking the courses in grades 7 and 8, the French language courses, they really see the value in French, not just as a subject, but as a life skill. So, fortunately, we have a strong parent group that also advocates for students taking French.
Are most of those students from Franco-Canadian communities, or do you have students that are from English-speaking families?
When you talk to representatives from the Bureau d'Éducation Française, if you talk about anyone who's Francophone doesn't just mean French first language. Francophone means someone who speaks and is learning French, or to whichever degree of mastery. And so with some of these families, you have one parent speaking French, in some cases both parents. In many, many cases for immersion families, neither parent speaks French. So the attraction for French immersion isn't just to pursue a language that is already spoken within the family, it's to pursue a skill that'll help students not just in their current language development, both in their first language and second language, but also in career opportunities, and also appreciation for other cultures and other global perspectives.
I wonder, now that we're social distancing and schools have shut down, how is that going to affect people who are in a French immersion program, but the parents don't have the language skills necessarily to support their French learning?
Well, the fortunate thing we have is within the Brandon School Division is we have the ability to provide meetings, conferences online, just as we're doing now. Instead of using Zoom, we use Microsoft Teams. But the idea is the same. So teachers are still able to meet with their students, converse with their students, either one-on-one or in small groups. Large groups can be a little bit more challenging just because of the nature of technology. If you have too many people talking at the same time, there's lots of feedback. But I think, like with anything, if you structure, and organize the content and the norms of the meeting appropriately, then it can still be a very effective way to help students keep up their oral language skills in a virtual environment. And it's not just contact with the teachers. We still have EAs, we still have our language monitor, who we can also help use to support the teachers in having as many people communicate in French with the students as possible, especially in the families where neither parent speaks French.
So for Franco-Manitobans, in places like Brandon, is it hard to find a sense of community? Are there large enough numbers to have that kind of community feel?
Well, it's interesting because when the province did their French language review a few years ago, that was one of the things they asked schools and teachers to look at. What was the level of engagement in the French community? And at the time when that question first came out, a lot of us had this perception of a French community means, a French first language group within your community. And, we quickly realized that, we do have some French communities nearby, but it's not always realistic to engage with them regularly. Some, if you go to Notre Dame de Lourdes, beautiful place, but lots of French first language speakers, but it also is, a long drive away, so it's not really realistic. So what we have been doing is we've been really pushing the idea of helping students realize that the French community isn't just French first language speakers, it's also all of us who are in the process of learning the French language. So we've been trying to engage with partnerships between classrooms, getting students together between grades, doing things like a field trip to see a French movie for several different grade levels, so that kids get together and see that it's not just they themselves in their classroom speaking French, but there are other groups of people in the community that are also learning French.
Eftihia, did you find that coming here from Quebec and then coming to Brandon?
I guess my big question is, and I think Eva certainly touched on it very well, is to really redefine what community means. Because depending on where you come from and the relative importance and historical identity of what it means to be part of a Francophone community, that will affect, your concept of how to participate in the community. So certainly what I try to do as someone who's not originally from Manitoba is I really try not to compare my experience of what it's like to be a Québécoise to what it's like to be a French speaker or a Franco-Manitoban, because I just think that it's would be disregarding the richness of what it is to be inherently part of a community here. And so part of the transition for me was to really move towards recognizing the specificities here and seeing what I can do to facilitate my students feeling more engaged, and also really understanding that the university is in itself a community, as opposed to thinking of the community as something that happens in your family or through your family. What happens with students arriving in university is that because they become adults in university, they also have to negotiate what it's like to redefine their own concept of community outside of their primary social relationships. And so in that respect, the university really becomes a space of community in which the classroom is not only a classroom that prepares them to have basic skills, but also allows them to think philosophically and culturally and historically about the concept of community. And many of my students really wish that all of the hard work that they engaged in with their teachers in high school and middle school and in university, they really wish that there were more opportunities for them beyond that. And the biggest struggle or the biggest difficulty, and I wish that, and this is why this podcast is so important for me, is that I really want our students to know that we all have a very important responsibility. And that responsibility is not incumbent only upon us as instructors of French language and culture, but also all of our allies who are not necessarily francophones, but really belong to the larger Canadian context. And they have an important role to play as allies to providing the resources that are necessary and to listening to us when we're expressing our needs.
Could you talk a little bit about the progression from French immersion school or a French language program in K-12 to transitioning to university and then beyond into career? What does that look like locally?
Maybe Eva can talk about all of the pre-university stuff, and then I could talk about the university.
Sure.
Stuff.
Yeah, like if a student is in French immersion, then they have the opportunity to continue their French immersion studies through high school in NELIN. And if they're in the English program, then they have the opportunity to take the French language courses up until like grade 7 and 8. It's a choice for them. And then again in grade 9, if they choose to continue their French language studies, they have that opportunity. In terms of like the transition from end of high school into career, from what I've observed from like my own past students who I've seen in the community, it really depends on the student and the degree of commitment to the student and willingness to take risks of the student to practice their French language skills in every context possible. So for example, I know of some students that work in local businesses, and I always walk in, I always speak to them in French. I always get that look of them as like, oh no, she's going to make me speak French. But my point is, like, and I have a conversation about it. I just want to make sure you guys have an opportunity to practice it, because I'm not going to judge you. And everyone feels when they're practicing their French like they're going to be judged if they make a mistake. So basically, it depends on the student. If they're a student who is willing and brave enough to take those risks and keep working on their French language skills in every context, every opportunity possible, then they tend to be much more successful, much more confident in writing down, yes, I can speak French on their CV and resume, because they have that opportunity to speak French in many contexts. One of the things that is possible is if a student continues their studies in French in the academic realm and doesn't take advantage of the different social and recreational opportunities to practice their language, then their language can be very well developed in the academic realm, but they might lack a lot of vocabulary and linguistic skills in using their French in other contexts. And so I think that's also important too, is not just, you're willing to continue to study the French, but also continue to see it not just as that, that subject area, that thing I do related to my academics or to my schooling, but also a skill that you practice and incorporate as part of your lifestyle to use whenever you can in the community.
Right. Well, I think that there's some specificities to add there in terms of what happens in university. Because one of the things that happens that's really specific to pursuing either just term-to-term courses in the French program or French department across Canada, or whether you decide to major or minor, is that you would still be taking languages courses. You would be taking at least 4 courses in languages, and then everything you do after that is entirely in French. So in fact, having courses entirely in French as opposed to just learning French means you're applying everything that you've learned this far in a context that is not just about what is useful in your everyday. Because part of pursuing a degree in university is really expanding your horizons beyond what is useful in your everyday. Something that prepares students through high school, but once they arrive in university, you really want them to be able to experiment with different venues and different horizons. And in that respect, I agree with you, Eva, when you say that it really depends on the level of risk that each student is willing to take. I've been privy to that type of conversation with my students quite a bit. Many of them are afraid to commit to something as great as majoring in French in university because they're afraid that they're not necessarily going to find a job afterwards. Others are afraid because they're like, well, where am I going to speak French beyond my degree? If I don't want to work in the government, where else do I speak it? And then others are like, well, it doesn't really matter where I'll get to speak it. What matters is that it's important for me. And because Canada has 2 official languages, and frankly, you don't really need to pursue your studies in English to speak in English. Pursue your studies in English to speak in English because English is a hegemonic language. It's going to be everywhere anyways. Many students feel like they might as well really focus and perfect their knowledge of French language and culture and Francophone language and culture because they know that they're going to add that to their profile. And in the long run, even if immediately they don't know what they'll gain, in the long run, they're putting all of the chances on their side.
Jackie, I saw you sort of smiling this whole time when we were talking about students taking risks. What's going on in your corner?
It totally resonates with me that I don't have a second language, and a big part of that is my unwillingness to put it out there and try it out. And I've noticed that I have friends and family that are understanding social distancing differently than I do. I have friends and family that are much more willing to take that risk, even if their pronunciation isn't perfect. And another thing that resonated with me was, just saying, I wish, back in grade 9, probably I had the highest mark in French in my class. And going into grade 10, it took a bigger commitment to continue with French because Saskatchewan was discontinuing it as a required class for graduation. And so I really wanted to make the bigger commitment, but I couldn't convince any of my friends to do that with me. And knowing what I know now, I wish I had followed through with it then, just like you said. It would have been life-changing for where I am now in my career, because I think I really would have used it if I had followed through with it. And if I could go back in time, I would probably make a different decision. But now I'm stuck with what I remember from my grade 9 French, and it's not that much.
But now you're an ally.
Yeah. Well, and I think too is French language educators, I think one of the things that we really need to remember is that, we can't just teach the language structures and the rules and the vocabulary in French. We also have to share our passion for the language. So, I don't speak French just because I have to. I speak French because I want to, because I love to be able to learn another language. I love to be able to communicate with someone here, there. If you travel internationally at all, French is a very common language spoken in many different countries, not just in Canada. And So I think one of the things that we've been really focusing on through looking at teaching strategies such as total physical response, language learning through storytelling, comprehensible input, the AIM method where they've used gestures to learn languages, is we're looking at different ways of engaging students to have fun learning French and to really see that it's not just a subject, not just a grammar lesson, that it is so much more. It's a new way to communicate, new way to appreciate new language, new culture, and it's really all about sharing the passion, not just the language learning.
Thank you for listening to the Research Connection podcast. You can visit our website for links to everything that was mentioned in the episode, and for more Research Connection content at www.brandonu.ca/bu-cares. Be sure to rate and subscribe so you can stay up to date with current research that impacts your community. Thank you.